This virus was good at transmitting between human beings from the word go, from the November or December of 2019. And the reason for that, we now know in molecular terms, it has a so-called receptor binding domain on its spike gene, which is well adapted to the human ACE2 receptor on our cells. Not very well adapted to other species receptors, which is intriguing.
So it's a specific human adaptation.
Well, not specific. It's not completely specific. It's quite good at lots of animals, but it's really good at us. Okay. And the other feature that it has that is very striking and very surprising is that it has something called a furin cleavage site. Now, this is a small section of the spike gene that is coded by about 12 letters of RNA genetic code, which has been inserted into it, compared with all its close relatives. And that gives it the ability to use a human enzyme called furin that is in all our many of our cells, in order to reconfigure the virus as it leaves the cell to make it, to as it were, prime it to attack another cell. So it's actually using one of our enzymes to spread in the body. This enables it to infect more tissues in the body and to multiply much more effectively. So it's the reason we're having a pandemic, is the furin cleavage site. If this virus didn't have that, it would probably have been pretty easy to control in the early months.
You said something very interesting, and this is another piece of the puzzle, I presume, is that compared to other viruses of its type, it has this interesting furin cleavage site. I've got that right. And you said that it had been inserted, and that's an anomalous statement, let's say. So there's something about this particular virus that sets it out against other viruses of its type, and it's this particular ability to use a human enzyme, and you described that as inserted. And so I presume that could be inserted as a consequence, hypothetically, of natural selection processes, or that there's other alternative explanations. So what do you see when you look at that?
What I mean by inserted here is that it's an extra piece of genetic information. We can look at 20 or 30 other very similar viruses, and we can line their genomes up and match them up against this one. And the furin cleavage site is not an altered bit; it's an added bit. It's an extra chunk that's been added in the middle of the spike gene.
So how do you differentiate between added and different? I presume that's a consequence of degree of divergence. So you could imagine that there's a set of viruses that are genetically and evolutionarily similar, so they stem from a similar source, and they have a predictable pattern of variation. And you're saying that this is an anomaly that exists outside that.
Well, you line them up. You align the genetic codes of the viruses, and in this particular part of the spike gene, they all align up quite well. You know, the sequence is mostly the same. You can tell it's been added because you can align the genes of the spike genes of other viruses alongside each other and see that this is an extra piece of RNA, not a changed piece of RNA. It's about 12 letters long, and this spells out a sequence that allows. It's called a furin cleavage site, and it allows the virus to use a human enzyme called furin to spread from cell to cell, from tissue to tissue, and effectively makes the virus much more dangerous and much more transmissible. It's the reason we're having a pandemic. If the virus didn't have this furin cleavage site, we'd probably have been able to get it under control very easily early in the pandemic.
You smart, you loyal, you're grateful. I appreciate that.